Sí, probando. So I was telling you that we had to enjoy the seminar, and this banquet or feast being prepared by the organizers. And I don't know if it's happened to you that in some countries all this issue regarding food and diet is becoming very important. I remember in a conference in which I took part in the Basque country, there was a group of businessmen, the endatari, and before beginning all the speeches, the chef came out and told us everything we were going to enjoy, we were going to eat. It really caught my attention. This is the case. Today we have a banquet, and please let me introduce our first lecturer. And it's really a pleasure to have in this seminar the first conference, Ed Diener. He's a professor emeritus in psychology. Joseph R. Smiley at the University of Illinois, as well as a senior scientist for the Gallup organization. He has obtained the highest awards in psychology, the Distinguished Scientist Awards from the American Psychologists Association, also the Association for Psychological Science, and the International Society of Quality of Life Studies. Professor Diener has been the president of 3 scientific societies: the International Society of Quality of Life Studies, the Society of Personality and Social Psychology, and the International Positive Psychology Association. Diener was the editor of the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology and the founding editor of 2 journals, Perspectives on Psychological Science and Journal of Happiness Studies. Diener has about 320 scientific publications, and over 72,000 scholarly articles have cited his research. He has received honorary doctorates from several universities and numerous other awards. His research focuses on the measurement of well-being, the temperament and personality influences on well-being, theories of well-being, income and well-being, and cultural influences on well-being. Recently, he has been studying the effects of subjective well-being on health and effective functioning. Professor Diener has most recently made a case for national accounts of well-being as input to policy decisions to complement economic and other indicators. Diener published a popular book with his son, Robert, about happiness, Unlocking the Mysteries of Psychological Wealth, as well as a book on policy uses of accounts of well-being with Richard Lucas. A 3-volume collection was recently published in the area of subjective well-being, as well as a book on international differences in well-being. That's why I tell you that in order to open this forum, we really have a specialist who will share with us his ideas about this topic. So welcome, Professor Diener.
Thank you to Eduardo and Francisco. You know, my name is Eduardo Francisco Diener. So it's very handy because they already told you some of the things that I'm going to be telling you today. So we'll go back over it. So my gratitude to the organizations that brought me, to Mariano and Ricardo for organizing my visit. So my message today is that it's time to create national accounts of subjective well-being to complement other social indicators and economic indicators. That we are now at the point where we think we can do this well and it will be meaningful. So there's 3 themes to my talk that Eduardo already talked about. The happy society is the good society. I'm going to talk about how happy societies perform better, not just that happiness feels pleasant or good. I'm going to talk about in what ways this goes beyond money, that money is important, but it's not enough in measuring the well-being of society. And in order to go beyond money, I think we need to measure well-being, because if you measure things, it gets people's attention, and you also know where you can improve things. So what is subjective well-being? Subjective well-being is people's evaluations of their lives. Is my life going well or is my life going badly? That can be thoughts, evaluating my life, or it can be feelings. So I give you examples here. My life is just great. I'm really enjoying life. These are high subjective well-being. On the other hand, you have, I'm depressed most of the time. I'm a loser. My life's terrible, right? That's low subjective well-being. And we find that there's at least 3 important elements that comprise subjective well-being. Positive feelings. People who have high subjective well-being feel most of the time love, joy, enjoyment. Not all the time, but most of the time. And they don't always feel euphoric or ecstatic, high, intense subjective well-being, but they feel modestly or mildly happy much of the time. We find that happy people have infrequent negative feelings. Occasionally, of course, you feel sad when your mother dies or you have some reason to be worried. But happy people infrequently, not much of the time, feel sadness, anger, anxiety. And then finally, we find various types of satisfaction make up subjective well-being. I'm satisfied with my life as a whole, not perfectly, but with most things. I'm satisfied with my work. I love my work. My health is pretty good. My relationships are good, and so forth. And although my health is not as good as it was when I was 20 years old, for a 66-year-old, I'm satisfied. My health is pretty good for a 66-year-old, so we take things into account. This is what subjective well-being is. And the question is, how do we assess subjective well-being or measure it? Because for the economists and statisticians, this is a crucial question. So for 30 years, I've been working on the measures and how valid they are. And what you see is that the first kind of measure we use on the top there are self-report surveys. We just ask people, how satisfied are you, 1 to 10? How happy are you? Are you happy 90% of the time or 50% of the time? And so we ask them these kind of questions, and that in world surveys is what occurs in national surveys. So the question is, how valid is that? Or do people just make it up? They say they're happy, or they lie to themselves, or what have you. So this is a very important question. To answer that question, we ask also their family and friends. How happy is that person? And we get 5 or more family and friends to tell us. We interview the person and we record them without their knowledge, and then we record how often they smile and laugh when they talk about their life versus frown. We look at biological indicators of happiness. For example, happy people have more left prefrontal activation and less right prefrontal activation. Happy people have stronger immune systems, so you can look at their immune reaction to, say, a flu germ that you put a little bit of under their skin. And we look at cognitive measures. How much happy things can people remember in their life, say in 1 minute or 3 minutes, versus how many unhappy things? How fast can they react to questions about happy things in their life versus unhappy things? So we use all of these measures, and what we find is that they converge. They come together to some degree. Not perfectly, there's little differences, but to some degree they all tell us the same people who say they're happy in the self-reports are also happy in all these other types of measures. So we have validity evidence then that the measures are at least pretty good. Now here is the Gallup World Survey. So here's the kind of thing that we might use with huge samples. Now we have 1 million people from the world in the Gallup survey. We ask them, how's your life? Where on the bottom of the ladder is the worst possible life you can imagine, and on the top of the ladder is the best possible life you can imagine. So anywhere from 0 to 10, what step would you say you stand on the ladder? And when we get that kind of data, we can look at countries, and we can see that much of the Western Hemisphere and Latin America is doing pretty well. Africa is doing poorly. You can see some of the Middle East is doing poorly, and then North America and Mexico and most of South America is doing very well in these measures compared to the worst off countries. We'll look at this in more detail later. Are the measures valid? I would say yes. Not perfect. I give them a B, not an A. I give them a B grade because there are some biases, but they're pretty good. I would say they're about as good as GDP in terms of how well they perform. They predict future behavior. They correlate with each other. Not perfect, but pretty good. Okay, now, why should we measure these things? So that's the next thing that economists and statisticians say. Sure, it's nice to be happy, but why on earth would you want to measure it? And I have 3 reasons for that we're going to talk about. The first reason is it's democratic. We don't ask the experts. We don't ask the government officials. We ask people to judge their life and find out what it is that's going well or poorly in their life. Because everyone wants to be happy. We find almost no exceptions. Everybody thinks happiness is important, and so first of all, it's a democratic thing to do. Secondly, and I'll talk about this quite a bit, it broadly reflects the quality of life of societies. So GDP tells us some things. It tells us how well we're able to feed our people, to house our people, and so forth, but it doesn't tell us other things, like the quality of the environment. So subjective well-being broadly reflects quality of life. And then finally, the most important one I want to bring, because it's a new one, it produces good outcomes. It's something like health or education you want in itself because it produces other good things. Okay, so we find that everyone wants to be happy. When you ask people in the United States, what do you want for your children? Sometimes they say, oh yeah, I want my kids to be successful, I want them to be healthy. But the number one thing they say is, I want my kids to be happy and to enjoy life and be pleased with their lives. And when we ask college students around the world in 50 countries to say, rate how happy is money, how happy is success, how happy is health, they rated all those things highly. But number one was happiness. They rated that higher than any of the others. And when you think about it, that makes sense. Why? Because everything we want is really so that we think our life's going well and we'll be happy. If you want to be rich, do you want to be rich because you think it would make you depressed and unhappy and miserable? No, you want to be rich and have income because you'll think you'll be happier when you're rich and better off in terms of subjective well-being. So here's a man who got it wrong. This is a joke from the New Yorker magazine. I could cry when I think of the years I wasted accumulating money, only to learn that my cheerful disposition is genetic. So what he's saying is I was trying to get happy by getting all this money, and then I got all this money, and then I found out I was happy anyway because it was inborn in my personality. Anyway, the second reason that we want subjective well-being measures on the national and international level is that right now we do mostly use GDP. We use some other things. We use crime statistics and so forth. But mostly, if you look at it, we use GDP, GDP growth, inflation, unemployment, and so forth. But subjective well-being reflects more. It does reflect income, and income is important. But it reflects more than that. For example, social relationships. So if you look at the quality of people's social relationships, you'll find that it predicts their subjective well-being. For example, in a country, distrust, crime, corruption, all lower life satisfaction. And on the other hand, and John Helliwell, I believe, will talk about this more, things like social capital, like people volunteering just because they want to help other people, help their community. Social support, I can count on others in an emergency. And feeling respected. All of these predict subjective well-being. And therefore, if you ask about life satisfaction, you pick up economic success, but you also pick up social success. And furthermore, you pick up something about environmental success, because the more green space in an area also predicts life satisfaction. People with parks around, trees, plants in their building. And on the negative end, things like air pollution, being downwind from a nuclear or a power plant that produces a lot of smoke, airport noise, living under where the airplanes land, difficult commuting, long, difficult, hard commuting every day that takes an hour to work and an hour back, all of these things lower life satisfaction. So what we see is that life satisfaction now is predicted by the economy, the environment, and social relationships and health, so that it becomes a global indicator of well-being. Here's national data. I did the regression coefficients, and you can see that in predicting life satisfaction, GDP predicts pretty strongly. But what you can also see is that holding GDP constant, you still have corruption, negative predictor. That should be low corruption, predicting positively. I can count on others in an emergency. I'll show you countries where that doesn't occur. And life expectancy, the health, even controlling for GDP. So life satisfaction is nice because it picks up many factors that are important to quality of life. This fellow in the slums of Calcutta, we interviewed, his name's Manoj, and he was very happy, and we wondered, how on earth can Manoj be happy? You see his house there, and he makes $1, $2, $3 a day. $3 a day he can feed his family. $1 a day he can't fully feed his family. And we said, Manoj, with this difficult life, you're a rickshaw driver, how can you be happy? And he said, well, you know, if I had more money, I would be happier than I am now, but I'll tell you how I'm happy already. I love my kids, they love me. I love my wife, she loves me. I have family and friends. I have religion that gives me meaning in life. And actually, I know I'm at the low end on the status of my job, but I enjoy being a rickshaw driver. So he had all these things in life that led to a successful life, even without money. Now, money would still help him so that he could always be sure he could feed his kids and get health care. But even without, so there's other aspects to quality of life besides simply money. In sum, then, subjective well-being summarizes much about societal life, quality of life, and it also helps us to give weights to these things, to know how to weight the quality of the environment, quality of social relationships, economics, and health. Here are some data from mostly the Western Hemisphere. In the Gallup World Survey, 160 countries, representative samples, Togo is the least satisfied country. You see on that 0 to 10 scale, Togo is a 3. And Denmark always comes in at the top, 7.8, 8. And so it is the highest life satisfaction country. Now, I also showed their GDP per capita there. And what you see is, and the 5 or 4 middle countries are Western Hemisphere countries. Haiti is the lowest. Canada is the highest. I didn't put Canada, but it's higher than the U.S. typically. And what you'll see is, for example, Costa Rica and the U.S. are almost identical in life satisfaction, even though the U.S. income is 5 times as high. So Mariano always loves this because he came from Costa Rica, so he's very proud of this, how well they've done. Now, if you skip over and look at respect and count on people and count on others in an emergency, you see that most of the Western Hemisphere is doing very well. Social relationships are working pretty well, except in Haiti. And then if you look at Togo, you know, people you can count on in an emergency, only 1/3 of the people say they have that, which is very bad. You know, if you need to go to the hospital or something like that, they just don't have people that they can count on or people they trust. In Haiti, many people don't feel respected. But the whole Western Hemisphere then seems to be doing badly in one way, and that is having corrupt governments. At least most of our people say that some elements in the government are corrupt. And you see that number is fairly high in the U.S. In my state of Illinois, it's very high corruption, and several of our governors are in prison and so forth. So sometimes people say, oh, Mexico has corruption, but of course the U.S. does too, and my state, very high. So that's something that probably lowers our life satisfaction compared to, if you look, Denmark, very low, 16%. Singapore, 4%. I mean, there are some countries that have succeeded in getting rid of corruption, and the thing is, it requires trust among people that other people aren't going to just be looking out for themselves. They're going to look out for the greater good some of the time, much of the time. So, I think this point will come out repeatedly. It came out this morning. We don't just need subjective well-being indicators. Once we learn that countries are happy or unhappy, then we don't have much unless we can relate that to other things, unless we can look within countries and say what groups are happy, in what regions are they happy and unhappy, or what problems are people encountering that are lowering their life satisfaction. We have to have these other measures that we can relate to subjective well-being. And just to give you a brief example, because I think this will come out more during the seminar, here is the United States and counties in the United States, over 2,000 counties. And the white areas we don't have data on. They're rural areas where our sample just isn't big enough to come up with a number. But what you'll see there is that the dark colors are high life satisfaction. And you can see that through the Rocky Mountain states. And also if you look at California, you probably know California. Some areas in California have high life satisfaction. And then right through the center of California is low life satisfaction. That's where I grew up. It's rural, it's agricultural. And so even within the same state, so what's going on there that we have low life satisfaction in my home? If you look at other areas in the country, you'll see the same thing. Some counties are thriving, some are not, and you have to then say, go through and pinpoint social and environmental factors that are producing this. The third cause, reason that we want to measure subjective well-being is that it is a cause of good things, not just an outcome. This is new, so I want to really emphasize it. I emphasized it last time I was in Mexico a year or two ago. It is a valuable resource in itself. It is not just an outcome because we're getting stronger and stronger evidence that happier people, on average, do better. We don't say that every happy person, we know there's happy people who are probably criminals. We know there's unhappy people who are doing very well in life in other ways. But on average, happy people are more successful in virtually every area of life. So if you look at causality, what direction is it? People with friends are happier. Obviously, if you have a lot of friends around and you're not lonely, you're going to be happier. But also, it looks like happier people, in turn, have more friends. They're more likely to go out and make friends. People like them better, and so forth. So what we find is that this is very important, that we measure high subjective well-being, not just because it reflects quality of life, not just because it's pleasant, but because it's a good thing to have, because it will help the country function better. Better social relationships, better health and longevity, better citizenship, and better work outcomes. For example, if you take a country where most everyone is angry, what you have is a situation, say in Egypt, where the country is in turmoil because lots of people are in negative states. Happy people have more friends. Think about it. Who do you want to hang out with? This unhappy Lisa or happy Lisa, right? And so, you know, happy Lisa is the one we find in studies. If we say to people, do you want to go back and be with that unhappy person another hour and talk to them about their life, or you want to go back with the happy? They always choose the happy person, right? And it's the same in everyday life, not just in our studies. We find that happy people are more likely to have better marriages and not get divorced. This is taking their happiness years before they get married. They're less likely to get divorced, and they're more likely to be better citizenships. That is, do things like volunteering. So yes, marriage can cause happiness, and you know, fighting with your spouse can cause unhappiness, but it can also be the other way around. Happiness produces health outcomes. Here I think the data are very strong now, that happy people live longer. Happy people on average are a little bit healthier. Why is that? Well, for one thing, Laura Kubzansky at Harvard has shown that happy people are more likely to do health behaviors. They are more likely to wear seatbelts, less likely to smoke, right? You smoke when you're stressed out. They are more likely to exercise and so forth. They have stronger immune systems. So you bring people into the lab, happy and unhappy people, you put a flu virus up their nose and you see if they get sick, and you also measure physiologically their immune strength, and you find that happy people, people high in positive affect, have stronger immune strength. And finally, less inflammation. Inflammation is a primitive way to fight disease, but it's hard on our cardiovascular system. It leads to clogged up arteries and so forth. And so we find that happier people have fewer cardiovascular problems. The cancer evidence is very mixed. The idea that happiness will protect you from cancer, those data are not strong, but the data on these other things is strong. And finally, happy people live longer. I think the data are now fairly strong, clear and compelling. So you may know the famous nun study that the happy nuns live 10 years longer than the unhappy nuns. I had the unhappy nuns when I was in school, the ones that used to kind of hit. Maybe I made them unhappy. But anyway, this study is a small study. There's much bigger, much better, stronger data now to show that happy people live longer on average. And then finally, in the workplace, subjective well-being in the workplace. You know, employers used to tell me, I don't care if my workers are happy. I just want them to work hard. I'm paying them. I don't want them to be happy. They don't have to enjoy their job. They should just work hard. And what I say to them now is we have evidence that if they're happy, they're probably going to work harder and be better workers. So why is that? First of all, they're going to have lower health care costs. That is, if you have happy workforce, they are probably not going to use as much as health care. We know that happy workers, people who are engaged and enjoy their job, take fewer sick days, for example. They have greater customer loyalty. Where do you like to go for a business to get your cleaning done or whatever? You want to go someplace where they treat you kind of nasty and they're unhappy, or where they're very friendly and nice to you. Greater employee turnover when workers are unhappy. That is, they quit and look for new jobs. Worker turnover in the United States, at least, is very expensive, especially when your higher level people are turning over. You have to educate the new workers. You have to search for them. For a mid-level to high-level manager, it may cost you $100,000 just to search for a new employee. So it's very expensive. So lower employee turnover is huge. And then finally, some greater productivity and creativity. We know from lab experiments that people put into a happy mood tend to be more creative. They think of more creative things. So if you want a creative workforce, and that becomes more and more important as you move into the information society and so forth, where it's not just you got a bunch of strong people who can do manufacturing jobs. That's still important, but you need more creative people so that you have people like the Google people who are thinking of new ideas. Now, here is a very interesting study by a guy by the name of Edmonds from Wharton Business School. Wharton Business School, one of the top business schools in the United States. And he looked at companies like the S&P 500 companies, and he measured all kinds of things about them that would predict their stock price. Like, what's their price to earnings ratio and capitalization, all these kind of numbers that economists and financial people love. And he predicted their stock price over time from those initial numbers. And then he added one other number that he had on a lot of companies, and that was, do they have engaged and satisfied workers? And that predicted an increase in the stock price of those companies above and beyond all that financial stuff that we've been looking at. This is huge. This means, and if you get 6% higher productivity and stock price from the fact that you've got happy workers in a company, psychologists like say, oh, 6%, that's nothing, 94%. No, it's huge in the business world. So these kinds of findings are very important in showing that happiness is a good thing to have in itself. So we can use national accounts of subjective well-being for two reasons. One for policymakers and decision makers and leaders, and the other is for the public as a whole. So John Helliwell, who will speak tomorrow, and I and a couple others, wrote a book, Well-Being for Public Policy. This is a difficult book, but if you want the details on that, we make the argument for well-being for public policy, and then the OECD guidelines I'll show you in a minute. But here are some policy examples. So not just we want a happier country, but how we make specific policies. So for example, how do we put research money on different diseases in the United States? Should we do diabetes more, or heart disease, or AIDS, you know? And then you've got all these people coming and saying, oh, we got to put more money into AIDS, and it's a political thing. And then other people say, oh, no, breast cancer. No, no. So it's really been allocated sort of politically rather than in some systematic way. And what we're saying is one thing that could help you allocate, besides life years, how many life years does this disease take on average, is how much misery does it produce? That is, the people with this, are they really miserable, or it really doesn't bother their subjective well-being so much? Not to say this is the only thing that counts, but it would be something that you could use to help you allocate research dollars. Reducing airport noise. At least in one study, you find that being under a very noisy airport where the planes are landing leads to reduced life satisfaction. The housing prices are lower in the area, but it doesn't make up for that. So now you start to say we need laws to regulate airport noise. We want airports located where the pathways are not over a lot of people. They come in, for example, Salt Lake City over the mountains. We want no flights after 10 at night, before 6 in the morning, and so forth. Zoning requirements in green space. They've done a great job in Singapore of this. Singapore's population has doubled, and at the same time, they've gotten twice as much green space. So what they've done is really put a press on having parks and trees around and so forth. So zoning laws that require that, and in that sense I think Mexico is doing pretty well. Some places that are totally concrete and concrete buildings and blacktop for parking lots like South Chicago turn out to be very bad places with higher crime and lower life satisfaction. And then awarding damages in lawsuits. So some legal scholars are arguing in the United States that when people get harmed, sometimes they sue somebody and try to get monetary compensation. And if they do that, how do you know how much they should get? And the subjective well-being data could help us decide how much the award would be. For example, if you lose a limb in that, we then look at people who have lost limbs. How much does it affect their life satisfaction? It would only be one measure that would help, but it could be a measure that somehow would make this slightly more scientific than now. It's sort of sentimentality or sympathy, something like that. So then in terms of educating the public, what we want our statistics to do is become known by the general public. So here we have the famous declining marginal utility of money. And when you see that, you say to people, look, if you make a certain amount and you're very poor, you're going to be happier. But once you get fairly rich, you're making $80,000 a year, and you want to double your income, and this happens in the United States, yes, you'll be slightly more satisfied with your life, but the effect is not big. Is it worth it? Do you have to make sacrifices to your family life? Do you have to, because oftentimes to double your income requires sacrifices, like if you're a lawyer, build up your work hours. Well, then you have to say, weigh that against that. And when people know about these data, then it's good information. They can think about it more clearly. Maybe they say, yes, to heck with my family, I want to make more money. But on the other hand, in my case, I said, wow, I got to think about spending time with my kids and wife, and not just moving to a different university where I would make more money. Here's one on marriage, and John and I disagree with this, and we're still working on this, where we say that the average person with kids is, you see what happens over time is the person goes along right in the middle there, year zero, they have a kid, their life satisfaction goes up, but then it kind of goes back down to where it was before. These type of data, if they turn out to be reliable, we're still working on them, are interesting, because what you could say to people is, hey, Kids don't, on average, make you any happier or any unhappier. I think what happens is some people love kids, and kids make them happier, me, and other people, you know, really, they shouldn't have kids in the first place. Don't have them. You'll be happier without them. So that's one other lesson to be taught from subjective well-being data. Should I kill my husband? Okay. Probably you should, but you'll be less happy afterward, at least right away. So these actually, of course, that's just a joke, show the widowhood data. And you see there's a big drop, and then widows come back, but it takes them quite a while, and they don't quite come back. So this is a worrisome group, right? Because we maybe need social structures to help them become more re-involved in society and so forth and not cut off. Unemployment. Well, if you kill your husband, you will now be unemployed because you'll be in prison. So this would affect you. But what you can see there is a very big drop when you get fired. Over time, you tend to adapt, but you still don't come back to where you were before. And furthermore, even if you get a job again, you don't come back fully. And furthermore, if you get unemployed multiple times, this effect becomes very large. It's as though it's not just money, because if you get a job again, you're not back to where you were. Somehow your self-esteem or your feelings of security have been hurt by unemployment episodes. So unemployment is a serious problem. Okay, so to summarize then, national accounts help in 3 ways. First of all, they measure something that people value. They measure something people want. You say measuring the arts, okay, or measuring fun. That's something people want. Why do we measure it? We don't have to defend it in terms of, well, it may make people more productive or something. It's a good thing in itself. Secondly, it helps us assess the quality of life of societies, but also groups, regions, particular people affected by particular circumstances. We have to have measures of those circumstances so we can relate those to why the subjective well-being is higher or lower in those groups. And then thirdly, it's a valuable resource in itself. Happiness or subjective well-being itself helps a society flourish, helps a society become more peaceful, more healthy, more sociable, and so forth. And if you look at the world data, and you see some of the countries where negative affect is high, anger is high, and positive affect is low, you will see that, and I won't mention countries, but you will see those are trouble spots. Those are places where they are having a lot of problems all the time, and problems with their neighbors and problems within countries. So happiness is a positive resource in itself. The OECD guidelines were already mentioned. I put up the website. The OECD guidelines, which just came out officially, are excellent. They talk about the strengths and weaknesses in the measures. They talk about when the measures can be used, what kinds of measures, how they might help. They're just absolutely outstanding. And if you're interested in more detail on this topic, I recommend those guidelines to you. Thank you very much.
So we have a few minutes for some questions, comments that you would like to make to Professor Diener. So we'll give you the floor if you wish to do so. The organizers, Ricardes, do they write down their questions? So let me read some and then this one is in English. It's from the London University.
It seems we are rediscovering Viktor Frankl. The specific question is, how are you measuring the meaning of life, if any?
Okay, so the question is, I got on the translator it in Spanish, so I have to read the question. The question is, how about meaning in life? So we have additional things beside the 3 things that I measured that people would like to see as part of these indicators. Some would like to see social relationships become directly assessed. Another one is meaning and purpose in life. And I've not argued for that so far because the data are so much thinner. There's so many fewer data. For example, right now we're doing a meta-analysis to find out if meaning and purpose in life predict longevity and health beyond subjective well-being measures. And I can tell you the answer is that we can't tell that yet because there are not enough data where both those measures are used and so forth. So many positive psychologists mention meaning in life as being very important, and it probably is extremely important, feeling that your life has purpose and meaning and so forth. And I think eventually those measures will come in. One of the things, though, we find about those measures is that they appeal to politicians sometimes, because sometimes politicians feel that the young people are out, they're very happy, they're having fun, getting drunk and all these things, and they're happy. That's the politicians. And they say, but do they have meaning and purpose in life? Do they know where they're going? Do they have goals and so forth? And maybe everybody my age starts wondering that about young people. Do they have goals? Are they working hard and all these things? So I think that to politicians, the meaning and purpose question. So in the UK, they do ask about life satisfaction in their survey, but they also have a question on meaning and purpose in life. And I think these questions are going to turn out to be just like questions about challenge and mastery. I'm good at what's important to me. I'm good at my job. I know how to do things required in life. The mastery questions can become important. But those questions in terms of science are just a few steps behind in my view.
There are a few more. Have you done subjective well-being measures in children? Is subjective measures in children related to subjective well-being in adults?
Yeah, so is subjective well-being in children, what about that? And I haven't done much of that. I found out that I'm very bad at it. We try to do it. I have a daughter who's a developmental psychologist. She told me never do it again. I know I love children, but I'm not very good at measuring happiness with them. But others have done that. Scott Hubner at South Carolina, for example, lots of work with that. And a couple things is, one is there is carryover. Of course, it's not complete. People change over time. We find in following people for 30 years now in Germany, people do change sometimes in their life satisfaction and happiness. And of course, children are more likely to adulthood to change even more. Yes, there is some amount of stability, but there's a lot of room for change. But we also find that children who are happy do better. That is, they too have better social relationships. Other kids like them more. The depressed kids, other kids tend to avoid. And in high school, we find that the happier kids are more involved in extracurricular after-school activities and stay busy doing things and so forth. So there's a number of things in kids and adolescents that subjective well-being is a positive predictor for.
Esta es de Benjamín Domínguez de la Facultad de Psicología de la UNAM. Along 20 years of working with chronic pain patients, cancer-related, I know that happiness level not always match with their biological state, not even income, but how can we perform this kind of assessment at national level?
Okay, so in reference to cancer, as I said, we don't know for sure now that cancer is affected by subjective well-being because there's some studies that say it is and some studies that say it isn't. And we also know that some people with cancer are not as depressed as you would think they would be because they're still functioning well. You can have even a fairly serious form of cancer, and if it's not producing much pain yet, you can still go about your relationships and job and so forth. Of course, your life satisfaction is a little bit lower, but not as much lower as we might predict it would be. So the question then for me is, well, if there's these states that are serious, that aren't affecting life satisfaction, satisfaction as much. What about that? And I would say life satisfaction measures aren't perfect. We're not going to use them by themselves. I'm going to throw out GDP and health measures and everything else. They aren't picking up every single thing, and I think that would be an example of it. Now, if you look at another area, mental illness, you will see that mental illness produces enormous misery. It is, in fact, in the U.S., the most underfunded of the illnesses. It produces a lot of miserable people. Schizophrenia not only makes the person less happy on average, but their whole family less happy on average. So, so there are diseases that do influence subjective well-being, although some of them don't as much as you would think.
Okay, Rocío Hernández del CRIM de la UNAM mentions that it is unethical to record an interview without the knowledge of the person, and also that decision makers should be aware of the risk of relying only upon self-report measures of subjective well-being. Although inexpensive, it is important to include also other cognitive robust measures such as emotional Stroop paradigm. So
the person saying that there are some problems with self-report that we ought to mention to the policymakers. I agree. Some of these other measures that we've developed, the Stroop is one task, but we've got lots of other measures of subjective well-being, are usually not used in big national surveys. They've been too expensive, so we haven't done it yet. So when we measure and when we tell the policymakers, you know, these measures aren't perfect, so you have to be aware of that. We also have to then also tell them, remember GDP. Let me mention the problems with GDP to you also. Do we do that? Never. Does President Obama know the problems and shortcomings of GDP? He's a very smart guy. He might, but most policymakers know nothing about the holes in GDP. So yes, there's problems with these measures, and we shouldn't rely on them by themselves. There's a few people, Lord Richard Layard in England, I think, is one who would just like to go with the subjective well-being measures. He's an economist, and yet he might be willing to ignore the economic measures. At least he goes pretty far. I'm not one of those people. I think we need them in addition to the other measures. Now, on terms of ethics, of course, in the interviews we do with the people, of course, they always know it's a study. They don't have to participate. In the third world countries where we went door to door, where there's not enough phones, which is most countries in the world, we got 85% agreement to be in the study. Random digit dialing in the United States, you get about 22%. So we've got very good samples in poor countries of the world.
Just one more. How is, and I will give you, all the questions, but is cultural activities, how cultural activities have influence in the subjective well-being? Cultural activities.
Cultural activities. I'm not sure what that means, but I will tell you this, I have a bias. It's against academics. All my academic friends say, we need more ballet and we need more opera. And then I go out to where I grew up on the farm and they say, we need more of that monster truck thing where the trucks pull against each other and drive over other trucks and all that. And then the academics say, this is terrible. I do think, and we have to be very careful not to get over here to the, gladiators, but which is like American football. But what we do want, of course, is a pleasant pastimes, leisure times, and so forth for people to engage in that will also make them grow and so forth.
Thank you.
Well, there's a question for us as INEGI that says, what's more expensive, to measure material well-being or subjective well-being? It's from the Mexican Center for the Philanthropy, Jose Ramon, CEMEFI. Well, it's more expensive to measure material well-being. The problem is that we are used to measure material well-being. And measuring subjective well-being, even though it's less expensive, requires additional resources. And that's the problem, in fact, to be aware and also make aware the political actors and the Congress Congress about the importance of measuring subjective well-being to have the resources to do so. And that's what we are doing. I would like to thank, on behalf of FLACSO and INEGI, Professor Diener. As we were expecting, it was really a banquet listening to you. Thank you.